Thank you for listening to Depictions Media Radio. Welcome to Policy and Rights, the show about human rights and government policy. Welcome back, everyone, to Policy and Rights here on Depictions Media Radio. I am your host, Michael Clogs, and as we know that the summit COP26 has begun, and that they're now in Glasgow negotiating over or discussing what needs to really happen in order to limit our climate temperature to 2.7 degrees Celsius. As we know, it has been reported that, hey, we were looking at 1.5 degrees Celsius as our global increase in temperature, and science has come around to the new increase to be 2.7 degrees Celsius. And there are things we can do to actually make this happen. And it turns out that we don't have to 2050 to 2040. We gotta act before 2030 comes. So that more or less gives us 8 years that we have to figure this out and how to change how our society operates so that we limit the carbon emissions into our atmosphere, which are causing the greenhouse effect that is raising the temperature. Now, there are some arguments out there that say that, hey, maybe this is just a natural progression in our planet's evolution, and that may or may not be true, but there are some things that are directly affected by our human societies and our human habits. Some of those are deforestation. We need to slow that process down and bring it to a halt. The fact of the matter is that in the last 10 years, we have more than doubled the space that we take up on our planet, squeezing out wildlife for urban areas. When we squeeze out the wildlife for urban areas, we have probably destroyed a forest. We've taken down a bunch of trees that we need to help put the carbon that is in the air back into the ground. That is one of the main things that the trees do for us, especially the taller old growth trees. We have seen here where we're broadcasting from in British Columbia that there have been some rulings to help curb old growth logging. Slow it down so that the trees can do their job, take the carbon out of the air, and put it into the ground. Along with some of those things that rise in carbon dioxide. Now remember, carbon dioxide is also the thing that when we breathe out, as I'm talking, I'm emitting carbon dioxide. Along with the raise in carbon dioxide, it also has an effect on our oceans. As that carbon dioxide dissolves into the ocean water, it has an effect on the coral reefs, like the great reef that exists in the Pacific. It deteriorates it. It changes the pH level of the ocean. as well as the temperature of the ocean. We're also talking about rising sea levels, where some island nations may no longer exist, or two, the residents and citizens of those islands need to find higher ground. They need to move all of their things to a higher place so that they stay out of the water, which means that they have less space to live on. More crowding for our fellow human beings. There are a number of issues that are going to be discussed at Glasgow that I can't even mention all of them here while I'm sitting here doing this broadcast. But they're all important, down to the most minute details that some of us just living can change a habit or two in order to do our part. We also need to make sure that our governments understand, like the Canadian government, the federal government is saying that the best that they can do is 45% reduction in carbon. When there are technologies out there, technologies and rebates back to citizens for things like electric vehicles, changing how we power our electricity, moving away from diesel generators, and finding more renewable ways of powering ourselves, that they can do better. By 2030, they could have reduced our carbon emissions maybe by 60%. But 45% is way too low. It's not allowing us to work hard enough for our survival as a species. It may not even scratch the surface of what we need to do in order to help do our part so that we can keep that 2.7 degrees Celsius in mind. So we're going to hear some things from the NDP leader, Jagmeet Singh. We're going to hear some things from Premier Kinney of Alberta. We're going to hear some things from the United Nations about what it's going to take to help us survive as the human race through climate change. What we're going to need to do, what we need to take action on in order to ensure a better planet. So let's listen and maybe all take action. Thank you for listening to Depictions Media Radio.
Thank you very much for joining us today. I'm delighted to have Ambassador Woodward, the Permanent Representative of the United Kingdom, and Ambassador Leteru, the Permanent Representative of Samoa and Chair of the Pacific Small Island Developing States, with us today to talk about the climate conference in Glasgow. Both ambassadors will be travelling to Glasgow, and so this is your last opportunity to talk to them about what we need to achieve collectively at the climate talks this weekend. So I will hand over to the ambassadors for some opening remarks, and then we will take questions from all of you. For those of you who are online, thank you for joining us, and if you could just indicate in the chat that you'd like to ask a question. So, Ambassador Woodward, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Carl, for joining me today. Good morning, everybody. It's very good to see you, and thank you for your interest in COP in Glasgow. Opens on Sunday. I'm flying this afternoon, so I'm delighted to see you. I think we should start off by saying the stakes are very high, and we know that. Our ambition is to keep 1.5 alive, and as you know, that means limiting the rise in global temperature to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial level. And this is an existential question. We've heard it from David Attenborough, we've heard it from Greta Thunberg, we've heard it from Nick Stern and so many other people, but I'm more than delighted that Power is joining me today, because this is truly existential for the small island developing states. And countries like Samoa are absolutely at the forefront of a crisis which they did not create. Those who have contributed least, like Samoa, are really doing the most so far in response. And already we've seen 21 small island developing states submit enhanced NDCs, and we very much welcome that. Now, the good news about COP is three things, I think. The first is, as the IPCC have told us, success is still possible. And that's very important as we go into Sunday's conference. The second thing I want to highlight is the deep commitment of my Prime Minister as the co-host of COP, and not just a personal commitment, but a national commitment. Last week, the UK published its net zero strategy, and the Prime Minister highlighted that this is about a competitive economic edge. So for all the challenges of building back from the COVID pandemic, we are looking to grow our economy and lower our emissions. And that's what we have been doing over the last few years. As part of that, we've also launched ahead of COP the Breakthrough Agenda, inviting leaders to join specific commitments to break through in the most challenging sectors. So the sectors like power, where coal is a particular problem, transportation, where road transport really needs a hard look if we're going to succeed at COP, hydrogen, again, part of the energy mix, and of course steel, as well as other difficult to attack industries. Third reason for optimism, I think, is that we go into G20 summit this weekend with our partners in COP, Italy, chairing the G20 summit. As you know, 80% of global emissions come from G20 countries. When the UK started as preparing as chair of COP, about 30% of global emissions were covered by NDCs and emissions restrictions. We've got that to 80%, but we need to move further. And we'll have a real push at G20 this weekend to get more commitments to net zero over the line. But, and this is why things turn on a knife edge and why Glasgow is such an important conference, we are, as we know, at the point of no return. So emitters cannot put their heads in the sand any longer. And the gap that we have between the nationally determined contributions that we need and those we've got delivered, between the pledges we've got and the policies that will underpin them, still leave us with a big gap in what my Prime Minister calls cash, cars, coal and trees. So the finance that we need, moving from combustion engine to electric-powered vehicles, moving away from coal and planting trees to give us back the lung that our planet needs. So there's a gap there. And we do need the money. And I want to emphasise this because we made the commitment, as you know, in Paris to raise 100 billion. We haven't quite got there. We think we'll get there late 22, early 2023. We'll continue to do our best to raise that money. We've seen pledges from the US alongside our own pledge, the UK, and a pledge from the EU and many other pledges coming forward. But the most important thing, I think, is to continue focusing on the money, but also to adapt our business models so that we can really get the money out of the door. We need to move forward on the adaptation and mitigation projects that countries need in order to protect themselves from climate change. So my final point would be, am I optimistic? I am hopeful. I'm hopeful and optimistic as we go into Glasgow. Leaders around the world, we have 140 leaders coming to Glasgow in person, have this at the top of their agenda, and we do have an opportunity to keep 1.5 alive in Glasgow. I'll step there and hand over to you, Pal.
Thank you very much, Barbara. Let me thank you for extending an invitation to Samoa and also on behalf of the PSITS. I firstly want to acknowledge and say that it's a tremendous effort on part of your government to organize this COP26 under very, very difficult situation. And I think, as you rightly put it, doing very challenging and unprecedented times. I think part of our challenge from small island Pacific countries is, of course, attendance at the highest level. But out of 14 of our Pacific Island developing countries, 13 countries will be represented. 4 at the head of state and government level, 2 at ministerial, 2 from officials coming from capital, and then 5 will be represented by ambassadors from New York and other embassies. But let me perhaps just say a few things about our expectation of the outcome of COP26. I think some of these are very much in line with what Barbara had already mentioned. On the 1.5 degree, for us that is not negotiable. For us that is a red line that we cannot and must not cross. I think the implication and the consequences of going beyond that is not something that I think we should anticipate, and it would be catastrophic for not only us in the Pacific, but for everyone. On the zero emission target for 2050, our expectation is that we hope countries will make pledges in terms of subsidies. Those need to be phased out correspondingly. We like to see an increase in funding for adaptation. We welcome a number of countries who have indicated that they will not support the creation or establishment of coal power plants overseas. I think that is something that is positive, and we want to see more countries join, as well as perhaps gradually reducing the number of coal power plants in their own countries. I think we understand that the transition that needs to be made will take some time, and I think we appreciate that. On finance, the 100 billion is the first step for us. I think that's very important, but equally important is that over the next 9 years, we want a continuation or raising the level of ambition in terms of financing. For us in the Pacific, we receive currently 0.5% of climate finance. But as Barbara rightly pointed out, we suffer the most in terms of the impact. So we look forward to perhaps getting a little bit more of the funding in the future. Real money. I think our concern has been when pledges are made, it goes from one pocket to the other. But we would like to see real money being added. We understand the difficulty, but I think if we are going to address this issue, then we will need to look at those options, including SDR. I think there is the issue of blending, the engagement of the World Bank and an IMF, to mention a few. And tied to that is we want to see the finalization of the Paris Rulebook. I think that's important for implementation purposes. There's no use having additional funding and then those are not being used. So we need to get those funding on the ground in terms of mitigation and adaptation activities. Two more points. One is that we firmly believe that the engagement and the leadership of the T20 is extremely important. I think Barbara has mentioned that they're responsible for 80% of the emission. So I think it's time that they live up to their commitment and pledges that they have made. And then finally, on ocean. This is an area that of critical importance to us in the Pacific for obvious reasons. We're surrounded by it. It links all our countries together, but there are also implications. The nexus between climate change and sea level rise will have implication for our small island states in the future in terms of loss of statehood as well as sovereignty, erosion of our maritime zone, etc., etc. So we want to see that at least being seriously considered. I know it's being part of the ILC and the 6th committee work, but I think we would like to see more focus on that and urgency in terms of its treatment. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassadors. And now we'll take questions from the floor and then some from the chat. Edie, please.
Thank you very much, Edith Lederer from the Associated Press, and on behalf of the United Nations Correspondents Association, thank you for doing this briefing. My question is to both of you. The original plan was to have $100 billion every year starting in 2020. Here we are in nearing the end of 2021, and we don't even have the first 100 billion. What is your assessment of why this money has been so slow in forthcoming?
Thanks, Edie, for that question. I think there's no doubt about the importance of that commitment in Paris to the 100 billion. And it's important, first of all, because we need the money, but it's an important signal because we need a lot more than 100 billion. We know that. We'll probably need several more 100 billion behind that, and probably even into trillions when you factor in the market and the business requirements as well. Why has it been slow? I think we certainly haven't been helped by the global economic slowdown following COVID, partly because countries have turned inwards, I think, to put their own economies back on track rather than focusing on the wider needs of the planet. But I've been very encouraged by the significant contributions we've seen. So we saw President Biden announce over 11 billion here at UNGA just back in September. The UK has put more than 11 billion into the contributions. The EU has put 4 billion euros in, and other countries have made contributions. So I think we've seen a momentum in recent months towards the 100 billion. Behind that, I think we have raised a significant awareness at the IFIs in particular of the greater need. And I know that many businesses, many financiers, including people like Mark Carney, have been working on financial mechanisms in the private sector. So there will be money. But, as Pal said, this can't be about pledges. It's got to be about real money turning into real mitigation and adaptation projects. It doesn't matter whether it's renewable energy technology, switching grids over, just transitions for coal miners. That's also what we've got to do. So we will continue to work towards the money, but we also need to make sure the money goes out the door and into projects that will change the climate. That would be my thought.
Thank you very much. I don't have much to add to that. I think, the COVID had introduced a new element into the equation. The pledges were made, in 2015 or thereabouts, and I think a number of development has occurred. But I think what is important is what Pablo has said, that recently we've had indication or clear commitment on the part of a number of countries. I think the US has made a very substantial pledge in terms of doubling their earlier in 2021 commitment. The EU, with 4 billion up to 2027. So I think and others have joined. Denmark and I think Sweden have pledged, substantial increases. And I think that is important. I think also, as I said earlier on, we also need to look at the situation where the funds are not, unlimited. So if you take from one pocket, something has to go without on the other. But I think the issue of climate change is so important that I think we need to look at new funding. And I think that there are plans in the pipeline for that possibility. So I think, as Barbara said, I think we need to be hopeful. I think to take a different position will not be helpful at this stage. Thank you.
Celia.
Celia Davaren, Africa Confidential. Climate change is a must. However, what can you do for countries in conflict or at war, where population, their main goal is to find something to eat, somewhere to live? They don't care about climate change. They care about their life and surviving. So what can you do for them?
So thank you for that question. And I would say that speaks to the heart of why the UK has been one of the champions of questions around climate security in the Security Council itself, because we recognise that so much conflict now is at its heart driven by climate change. And as you say, when you see drought, you see fights for land, you see swarms of locusts, you see flooding, all of those things are drivers of conflict and then lead to the humanitarian disasters that you are referring to. So what can we do for those people? Immediately, of course, we can do our very best through humanitarian aid, and I pay tribute to the work that OCHA does. But I do think we need to get behind that and to get more deeply into questions of climate security, because those are the questions that are driving so many of the conflicts that we see today. Thanks.
I just want to add perhaps a slightly different angle to what you said. Perhaps, again, in the context of Pacific Island countries, we are in a similar situation if you take the impact of climate change. So the question for us is, do you then use the funding that is available to deal with the impacts of climate change at the expense of our basic needs, and I think you refer to that. Not only basic needs in terms of food, etc., but the social aspect of our country. So those are difficult questions, and it's similar to what's happening in countries under conflict and war. But I think we need, as a collective, I think one of the things we've got to remember is that climate change is now a global issue. And I think it requires all of us to work together if we are going to address this situation.
We're now going to take a question online and then we'll come back to the room. So, Michelle, over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Marco, and thanks, ambassadors, for the briefing. Ambassador Woodward, a question for you specifically about Glasgow. Have the Chinese indicated at all whether President Xi might join by video? And are there concerns that China, given sort of the recent announcements from China, including those that were made at the UN General Assembly, are there concerns that China may not have anything left to offer? Thanks.
Important thing to say is that this is an in-person summit. So we have been very clear as hosts that we welcome everyone to participate, but it will be in person. We've got around 140 global leaders coming in person. The Chinese have indicated that they'll be represented by their lead climate negotiator, Xie Zhenhua. So we understand that President Xi Jinping will not be coming. But we did note with great interest the climate strategy that China published earlier this week, which set out very clearly how they plan to meet the targets that they've set of by 2030 and by 2060. So there's some quite specific plans set out in that, and we'll have no doubt have an opportunity to discuss them further at the G20. Thanks.
A question from Benno.
Thank you, Mangu. Thank you, ambassadors. Benno Schinghammer with the German press agency. Ambassador, I don't know if you can speak about that or how much you can speak about that, but could you maybe outline what kind of concrete impact climate change has on Samoa right now and how it might turn out if the 1.5 degree aim is not met?
Well, I can go all day. But I don't think we have the time. But let me perhaps deal with the impact, the nexus between climate change and the ocean, because that is important for us. Climate change, if we go beyond this 1.5, the impact of warming will affect our reef ecosystem, for example. It will affect fishery, which a lot of our coastal population depend on. So it's a source of livelihood will be affected. And that is happening at the moment. When you look at some of our population around the coast, that it's all around the islands. They're finding it very difficult to secure what we used to secure in the past. So that's going to affect the population, their livelihood, and also nutrition. That's going to be very, very difficult. Climate change also in terms of sea level rise, for instance. That's going to impact, if you look at agriculture, it raises the water, the sea level, and that's going to affect the salinity of the soil, and therefore agriculture will be compromised in terms of food production, etc., etc. It will also affect, the population, especially those on the coastal side. So then now they have to move inland, and that create problems for us as well, because for some of our islands, especially the volcanic one, and your question was specifically to Samoa, that means that we have to move to higher ground. So that again is another implication of climate change. So I think, just on those, I can go on. It will also impact. When we talk about loss and damage in terms of cyclones, the frequency and severity of those, it, just devastate our development. It just takes a couple of days of cyclone and everything is gone. Not only, physical, but also the lives of some of our people. So it's a difficult situation. It's even worse for our atoll island states, sister state like Kiribati and Tuvalu, for example. Half a meter of sea level rise will devastate those two countries. They will just go under. So those are unfortunately, that is what's happening. And we have to deal with those on an everyday basis. It's not like something that we're just sort of talking about. It's not an academic question for us. It's a reality and we're living it every day. Thank you.
Majid and then Kristen.
Thank you. Thank you both of you for this briefing. Ambassador, one of the consequences of climate change is somewhat the use of one of the consequences, which is the water shortage and drought, strategically by some powerful countries against weaker countries. We are seeing that, for example, between what Iran is doing with water source with Iraq, or Turkey is doing with Syria and Iraq, or with even between near future between Palestinians and Israelis. On this political issue, do you think the international community can take some measures that could have concrete impact in order to limit the use of the impact of climate change by powerful countries as an advantage against the weaker countries? Thank you.
Do you want me to start?
I think, can I tease out two questions from what you've said? The first is just to underline the importance of water. We know all around the world, whether it is for islands, both from island nations, or rivers, how desperately humanity depends on water and how much that is declining. So there are convincing arguments being made that actually water shortages are going to be absolutely critical as we go forward in the coming decades. So I think you've hit a really important question. On the question of weaponising climate change and water, I think the point that you made about rivers is a very good one. And it's not always the powerful. It's often depending on where you are in the passage of the river, as it were. And there are UN mechanisms that deal with, international mechanisms, as well as regional ones, that deal with fair and equitable handling of dams, which is what it basically comes down to. It's something that we have actually discussed a bit in the Security Council. We had a discussion about the Ethiopian Grand Renaissance Dam. I think our view was that was a very important briefing for all of us, but it is probably better that the local regional parties to the river, to the dispute or discussion, are the ones who need to solve it. So that was the spirit in which we concluded. But I agree with you, we do need to find ways of amicably making sure that as resources dwindle, we have fair access to them and they aren't weaponised.
I think we have time for one more question. That's all, Kristen.
Kristen Salumi from Al Jazeera English. Thanks for the briefing. The UN just released a study that says $243 billion is still going to subsidize the fossil fuel industry from governments. And I'm wondering, since you're struggling to come up with $100 billion, it may be a naive question here in the halls of power, but the casual observer would say, why can't we just switch that money over? Why can't we do that? Madam Ambassador, do you want to take a stab at that? And Mr. Ambassador, how does it make you feel when you hear those numbers?
But I think it goes to the heart of what you said earlier, Pat, which is this can't be about pledges. It has to be about real money. So let's not lose sight of that.
I think that it also goes to the heart of what you said earlier, Pal. We recognise that some countries are very dependent on fossil fuels for energy security, and that, of course, holds up jobs and therefore the economy. So it is not possible to make a sudden cut-off, but it is possible to continue to move in the right direction. And that's why we all welcome the announcements of no new international coal funding that we've seen from China, we've seen from Japan and Korea. But, as Pal said, we now need those translated into domestic arrangements. And we've managed to do that in the UK. We're still waiting to see how that can happen, and the G20 discussions, well, I think will be another very important point. So I agree with you, the maths looks very tempting, but it's not going to be quite as simple as that. But those numbers are pretty telling about the importance, but also I think the challenge that we need to unpick to make that transition work. Thanks.
Thank you for listening to Depictions Media Radio.
Negotiations that we've seen on the international scene, such as the phasing out of CFCs, for example, where we had very, I won't call them simple, but certainly simpler technical solutions. It was a very specific problem. Fossil fuels are present in pretty much every of our society's sectors all around the world. So it is complex. You have, depending on the conference, but anywhere between 140 to 180, sometimes more countries that are participating. So it's a very complex thing. There's no two ways about it. I don't think that public shaming is for those who do not do what they said they would is the only thing that happens, because right now what we're seeing is that, and I was alluding to that in my remarks earlier, the economy of the 21st century will be a green economy, and that's becoming very, very clear. And it's not just environmentalists talking about this, but more and more business people and certainly the investment community. We're seeing very large investors, pension funds, institutional investors saying we're moving away from fossil fuels and we're moving into clean technologies, into renewable energy, into public transit. We've heard the Caisse de dépôt et placement say that they were pulling all of their investment out of oil in the coming two weeks. And it would be too easy to say that it's just a Caisse de dépôt et placement, because this is a worldwide movement. So not being willing to tackle the issue of climate change, it is certainly an environmental issue. It's a social issue, but it's becoming more and more about what will the economic development of your country look like, and what kind of opportunities will you be missing if you refuse to do that. And the last thing I will say is that there are increasing discussions about things like border tax adjustment. We've heard the Deputy Prime Minister, Minister of Finance, Freeland, speak about this, certainly with her counterpart in the U.S., Janet Yellen. The European Union is looking into this. So there is a conversation happening about going even beyond some of the measures that were adopted in the past to try and ensure that everyone is doing its fair share.
Thank you for that. As a follow-up, I have a question from 16-year-old Aliyah Kirji. She's a climate activist who is going to COP, and she said that she wants her voice heard, especially for young people. This is her question. She says, "You know all too well that the government has consistently ignored the demands for climate ambition from its people. What is your plan to ensure the people, especially young people, are heard by all members of parliament when it comes to issues of climate justice?" So what would you say to her and young people like her?
Well, there's many things I could say, but we value so much the point of view and the opinion and certainly the energy of our youth that we've reserved six spaces on the Canadian delegation for youth. It's not every country that does that, but because we think that they can contribute. In fact, I was myself a youth representative a long time ago, you might argue, on the Canadian delegation, but I understand the importance and the value that youth can contribute to these debates, and that's why we're specifically reserving space on the Canadian delegation for them and for their voices to be heard.
Merci. La prochaine question est de Laurence Martin. Laurence, s'il vous plaît, votre média.
Oui, bonjour, Laurence Martin de Radio-Canada. Vous m'entendez bien?
Très bien.
Bon, dans la délégation canadienne, il y a évidemment M. Legault, qui entend construire un troisième lien, on en a parlé un peu plus tôt, qui, selon certains rapports médiatiques aujourd'hui, n'aurait pas consulté les environnementalistes avant de partir. Quel message est-ce que ça envoie, d'après vous?
Je ne dirais pas à M. Legault comment faire son travail. Ce que je peux vous dire, c'est que pour nous, l'opinion des écologistes, mais aussi, je parlais des jeunes il y a quelques minutes, du mouvement syndical, des provinces, des Premières Nations, des municipalités. Donc, nous invitons ces gouvernements, ces organisations-là sur la délégation canadienne. Donc, nous réservons sur la délégation canadienne 6 sièges pour les représentants des ONG, 6 pour les jeunes également. Puisque je le disais dans mes remarques tout à l'heure, mais je pense que les écologistes, le mouvement écologiste joue un rôle très important dans une société comme la nôtre et c'est parfois inconfortable. Je serai à certains moments probablement critiqué. Je l'ai déjà été par certains de mes ex-collègues. Et dans une démocratie, c'est tout à fait sain. Et c'est très important. Alors pour nous, nous voulons leur faire une place. Nous voulons entendre ce qu'ils ont à dire. Aux autres de faire les choix qui leur conviennent.
Mm-hmm. Mais est-ce que vous diriez que vous et M. Legault êtes sur la même longueur d'onde ou avez une vision commune, la même vision quand il est question de stratégie pour la lutte contre les changements climatiques?
Je pense que je suis pas le premier à le dire. Là. En fait, je l'ai déjà dit lorsque j'étais du côté des écologistes, mais le Québec a fait beaucoup en matière de lutte au changement climatique. Nous avons été la première province, le premier État, si vous voulez, en Amérique du Nord à mettre un prix sur la pollution. Nous avons, en matière d'électrification des transports, la bourse du carbone. Donc, le Québec a posé un certain nombre de gestes très, très audacieux au cours des dernières années. Mais cela étant, ce n'est pas parce qu'on a bien fait dans le passé que l'on peut s'asseoir sur nos lauriers et dire, bon, ben bravo, c'est fini, c'est réglé. Alors, tout le monde doit faire plus. Nous devons faire plus au Canada et l'ensemble des grands émetteurs de la planète doivent faire plus également. Alors, je pense que là-dessus, sur la nécessité de lutter contre les changements climatiques, il y a certainement beaucoup de terrain d'entente entre le gouvernement du Québec et le gouvernement du Canada. J'ai déjà parlé à M. Charette à plusieurs reprises, à la fois dans mon ancien rôle comme ministre du patrimoine. Nous ne sommes pas encore parlé depuis au cours des 4 derniers jours, mais j'ai très hâte de le voir. C'est quelqu'un que je connais depuis longtemps et avec qui je m'entends très bien. Donc, je pense que sur certaines choses, nous allons pouvoir travailler ensemble avec le gouvernement du Québec. Cela étant, il y a des choses sur lesquelles on ne s'entend pas nécessairement.
Merci beaucoup. The next question and the last of this media availability would be for Theophilus. Please unmute yourself and state your media.
Hi, Theo Argytis, Bloomberg News. Good morning, Minister Guilbeault.
Good morning.
I just wanted to do a quick follow-up on the Line 5 question because the Canadian government's position on Line 5 is pretty unambiguous. Can you tell us whether you support Line 5, the Line 5 pipeline or not?
My government has announced in the past that we supported the continued operation of Line 5.
Thank you.
Do you have a follow-up question?
But you didn't say that whether you supported it or not. You said your government has supported it.
Being part of the government, I support my government's position.
Right. Thank you.
We have time for one last question. Cormac McSweeney, please unmute yourself and state your media.
Yes, Cormac McSweeney with City News. Just wanted to quickly ask you on the COP26 summit itself again, if you could repeat in English what you had said in French when you were asked whether you're optimistic or pessimistic about the outcomes of this conference and whether other countries will be able to commit to what you're looking for, the same level that Canada has in terms of targets and action to deal with climate change.
I'd say at this point, having been to a number of these meetings, I'm cautiously optimistic. I mean, we have 2 weeks of negotiations ahead of us. Heads of government and heads of state, a great number of them will be there. We'll have ministers of the energy, ministers of finance, ministers of transportation, ministers of the environment. So there's going to be an important, certainly one of the most important diplomatic efforts to try and find pathways so we can accelerate the fight against climate change. And one could argue that it's probably the most important diplomatic effort like that since the Paris conference in 2015. So clearly, the fact that all these people are going to Glasgow is a sign that the governments around the world want to try and find a solution now, or solutions. Now, it's not. That being said, it's not always enough to show up. We can't always agree, but I'm confident, and the fact we already have an agreement to achieve the $100 billion per year of investment from industrialized nations to help developing countries face climate change. I think that's a significant step forward, something we collectively at the international scene hadn't been able to achieve since 2009. And I mean, I'm going to brag a little bit, but Canada is part of the reason why this achievement came about. The work of my friend and colleague Jonathan Wilkinson was key in making that happen. Obviously, his German counterpart played an important role. The UK presidency as well, but we've already found a solution to a very tricky element of the negotiations, to which we hadn't been able to find a solutions for more than 10 years. So for me, that's very encouraging.
Okay, and in terms of what Canada is going to announce in terms of domestic measures at COP26, you have already ruled out any new targets. That what we set in the spring, the 40 to 45% is the target that we have going into this, and we'll have coming out of it. But you said that we will hear more about the plans in regards to oil and gas, the cap and cut plan for oil and gas that we heard in the election campaign. So I'm wondering, what will we hear on that promise that we didn't hear in the election? If you can elaborate on that a little bit, and will that include financial supports for the oil and gas sector to help them make that transition moving forward with these new targets that you have for them in cutting emissions?
If I gave the impression that we would be defining those campaign commitments, then that was not my intention. I mean, the way it works, we will obviously have to do consultations with provinces and territories, industry, civil society, indigenous or organizations to develop and define those measures. I've said that we would be calling on our Net Zero Advisory Board to do that, but the fact that these measures were announced as part of an election campaign, but what we will be doing is we will be confirming on the world stage these measures, this commitment that Canada is taking to go further and faster in the fight against climate change. Negotiations that we've seen on the international scene, such as the phasing out of CFCs, for example, where we had very I won't call them simple, but certainly simpler technical solutions. It was a very specific problem. Fossil fuels are present in pretty much every of our society sectors all around the world. So it is complex. You have, depending on the conference, but anywhere between 140 to 180, sometimes more countries that are participating. So it's a very complex thing. There's no two ways about it. I don't think that public shaming is for those who do not do what they said they would is the only thing that happens, because right now what we're seeing is that, and I was alluding to that in my remarks earlier, the economy of the 21st century will be a green economy. And that's becoming very, very clear. And it's not, just environmentalists talking about this, but more and more business people and certainly the investment community. We're seeing very large investors, pension funds, institutional investors saying we're moving away from fossil fuels and we're moving into clean technologies, into renewable energy, into public transit. We've heard the Caisse de dépôt et placement say that they were pulling all of their investment out of oil in the coming two weeks. And it would be too easy to say that it's just a Caisse de dépôt et placement, because this is a worldwide movement. So not being willing to tackle the issue of climate change, it's certainly an environmental issue. It's a social issue, but it's becoming more and more about what will the economic development of your country look like, and what kind of opportunities will you be missing if you refuse to do that. And the last thing I will say is that there are increasing discussions about things like border tax adjustment. We've heard the Deputy Prime Minister, Minister of Finance Freeland, speak about this, certainly with her counterpart in the U.S., Janet Yellen. The European Union is looking into this. So there is a conversation happening about going even beyond some of the measures that were adopted in the past to try and ensure that everyone is doing its fair share.
Thank you for that. As a follow-up, I have a question from 16-year-old Aliyah Kirji. She's a climate activist who is going to COP, and she said that she wants her voice heard, especially for young people. This is her question. She says, "You know all too well that the government has consistently ignored the demands for climate ambition from its people. What is your plan to ensure the people, especially young people, are heard by all members of parliament when it comes to issues of climate justice?" So what would you say to her and young people like her?
Well, there's many things I could say, but we value so much the point of view and the opinion and certainly the energy of our youth that we've reserved six spaces on the Canadian delegation for youth. It's not every country that does that, but because we think that they can contribute. In fact, I was myself a youth representative a long time ago, you might argue, on the Canadian delegation, but I understand the importance and the value that youth can contribute to these debates, and that's why we're specifically reserving space on the Canadian delegation for them and for their voices to be heard.
Merci. La prochaine question est de Laurence Martin. Laurence, s'il vous plaît, votre média.
Oui, bonjour, Laurence Martin de Radio-Canada. Vous m'entendez bien?
Très bien.
Dans la délégation canadienne, il y a évidemment M. Legault, qui entend construire un troisième lien, on en a parlé un peu plus tôt, qui, selon certains rapports médiatiques aujourd'hui, n'aurait pas consulté les environnementalistes avant de partir. Quel message est-ce que ça envoie, d'après vous?
Je ne dirais pas à M. Legault comment faire son travail. Ce que je peux vous dire, c'est que pour nous, l'opinion des écologistes, mais aussi, je parlais des jeunes il y a quelques minutes, du mouvement syndical, des provinces, des Premières Nations, des municipalités. Donc, nous invitons ces gouvernements, ces organisations-là sur la délégation canadienne. Donc, nous réservons sur la délégation canadienne 6 sièges pour les représentants des ONG, 6 pour les jeunes également. Puisque je le disais dans mes remarques tout à l'heure, mais je pense que les écologistes, le mouvement écologiste joue un rôle très important dans une société comme la nôtre et c'est parfois inconfortable. Je serai à certains moments probablement critiqué. Je l'ai déjà été par certains de mes ex-collègues. Et dans une démocratie, c'est tout à fait sain. Et c'est très important. Alors pour nous, nous voulons leur faire une place, nous voulons entendre ce qu'ils ont à dire, aux autres de faire les choix qui leur conviennent.
Mm-hmm. Mais est-ce que vous diriez que vous et M. Legault êtes sur la même longueur d'onde ou avez une vision commune, la même vision quand il est question de stratégie pour la lutte contre les changements climatiques?
Je pense que je suis pas le premier à le dire. Là. En fait, je l'ai déjà dit lorsque j'étais du côté des écologistes, mais le Québec a fait beaucoup en matière de lutte au changement climatique. Nous avons été la première province, le premier État, si vous voulez, en Amérique du Nord à mettre un prix sur la pollution. Nous avons, en matière d'électrification des transports, la bourse du carbone. Donc, le Québec a posé un certain nombre de gestes très, très audacieux au cours des dernières années. Mais cela étant, ce n'est pas parce qu'on a bien fait dans le passé que l'on peut s'asseoir sur nos lauriers et dire, bon, ben bravo, c'est fini, c'est réglé. Alors, tout le monde doit faire plus. Nous devons faire plus au Canada et l'ensemble des grands émetteurs de la planète doivent faire plus également. Alors, je pense que là-dessus, sur la nécessité de lutter contre les changements climatiques, il y a certainement beaucoup de terrain d'entente entre le gouvernement du Québec et le gouvernement du Canada. J'ai déjà parlé à M. Charette à plusieurs reprises, à la fois dans mon ancien rôle comme ministre du patrimoine. Nous ne sommes pas encore parlé depuis au cours des 4 derniers jours, mais j'ai très hâte de le voir. C'est quelqu'un que je connais depuis longtemps et avec qui je m'entends très bien. Donc, je pense que sur certaines choses, nous allons pouvoir travailler ensemble avec le gouvernement du Québec. Cela étant, il y a des choses sur lesquelles on ne s'entend pas nécessairement.
Merci beaucoup. The next question and the last of this media availability would be for Theophilus. Please unmute yourself and state your media.
Hi, Theo Argytis, Bloomberg News. Good morning, Minister Guilbeault.
Good morning.
I just wanted to do a quick follow-up on the Line 5 question because the Canadian government's position on Line 5 is pretty unambiguous. Can you tell us whether you support Line 5, the Line 5 pipeline or not?
My government has announced in the past that we supported the continued operation of Line 5.
Thank you.
Do you have a follow-up question?
But you didn't say that whether you supported it or not. You said your government has supported it.
Being part of the government, I support my government's position.
Right. Thank you.
We have time for one last question. Cormac McSweeney, please unmute yourself and state your media.
Yes, Cormac McSweeney with City News. Just wanted to quickly ask you on the COP26 summit itself again, if you could repeat in English what you had said in French when you were asked whether you're optimistic or pessimistic about the outcomes of this conference and whether other countries will be able to commit to what you're looking for, the same level that Canada has in terms of targets and action to deal with climate change.
I'd say at this point, having been to a number of these meetings, I'm cautiously optimistic. I mean, we have 2 weeks of negotiations ahead of us. Heads of government and heads of state, a great number of them will be there. We'll have ministers of the energy, ministers of finance, ministers of transportation, ministers of the environment. So that there's going to be an important, certainly one of the most important diplomatic efforts to try and find pathways so we can accelerate the fight against climate change. And one could argue that it's probably the most important diplomatic effort like that since the Paris conference in 2015. So clearly, the fact that all these people are going to Glasgow is a sign that the governments around the world want to try and find a solution now, or solutions. Now, it's not. That being said, it's not always enough to show up. We can't always agree, but I'm confident, and the fact that we already have an agreement to achieve the $100 billion per year of investment from industrialized nations to help developing countries face climate change, I think that's a significant step forward, something we collectively at the international scene hadn't been able to achieve since 2009. And I mean, I'm going to brag a little bit, but Canada is part of the reason why this achievement came about. The work of my friend and colleague Jonathan Wilkinson was key in making that happen. Obviously, his German counterpart played an important role. The UK presidency as well. But we've already found a solution to a very tricky element of the negotiations, to which we hadn't been able to find a solutions for more than 10 years. So for me, that's very encouraging.
Okay, and in terms of what Canada is going to announce in terms of domestic measures at COP26, you have already ruled out any new targets. That what we set in the spring, the 40 to 45% is the target that we have going into this, and we'll have coming out of it. But you said that we will hear more about the plans in regards to oil and gas, the cap and cut plan for oil and gas that we heard in the election campaign. So I'm wondering, what will we hear on that promise that we didn't hear in the election? If you can elaborate on that a little bit, and will that include financial supports for the oil and gas sector to help them make that transition moving forward with these new targets that you have for them in cutting emissions?
If I gave the impression that we would be defining those campaign commitments, then that was not my intention. I mean, the way it works, we will obviously have to do consultations with provinces and territories, industry, civil society, indigenous or organizations to develop and define those measures. I've said that we would be calling on our Net Zero Advisory Board to do that, but the fact that these measures were announced as part of an election campaign, but what we will be doing is we will be confirming on the world stage these measures, this commitment that Canada is taking to go further and faster in the fight against climate change.
Thank you for listening to Depictions Media Radio.
Thanks for being here. Merci d'être ici. I want to chat about, first off, COP21 and some of our priorities. I'll be attending, and I want folks to know that you can count on New Democrats to fight to see real concrete action, that Canada is doing its part. And we're going to focus on three things in particular that we want to see from Justin Trudeau and from the Liberal government. First off, we want to see bolder ambitions to reduce emissions. We need to have higher targets. We campaigned on at least 50% reductions in emissions, and we want to see this Liberal government get as close as possible to 50%. They put out a target that's below 50%. We want to push them as high as possible. In the States, President Biden is doing 50%. That's their commitment. They're coming to COP with that commitment. We want to see Canada as close as possible to 50 or even higher. But 50 is what we're hoping for, and we're going to try to push the Liberals to be as high as possible. They've given a range of 40 to 45. We'd like to see them at the higher end of that. We also want to see a real commitment to ending fossil fuel subsidies. The federal government should not be subsidizing new oil and gas. What the federal government should be using and incentivizing with federal resources is to invest in sustainable energy and sustainable sources of energy, renewable energy. That's where we should be using our federal resources, and we should be incentivizing. And so we're going to, again, push hard to make sure there are some clear commitments to end fossil fuel subsidies and to instead incentivize renewable energy. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, we cannot fight climate crisis by leaving thousands of workers behind. So there has to be a clear plan to invest in creating good jobs for workers, to make sure workers are not left behind, to give them a clear path. What is it going to look like for them and their families and their futures? We want to make sure that in our commitment to fight this climate crisis, we bring everyone along. We will not be able to move forward if the workers who are right now worried about their future are not included in the plan. And so that's something that's very important to us. And I want workers to know that while everyone believes strongly that we need to have real action on fighting the climate crisis, New Democrats also believe we cannot leave workers behind. And we are committed to making sure there's a clear path that ensures a bright future for all workers. we know that this is one of the most urgent crises of our time, and I'm intending to convey our commitment as a party, my personal commitment to fighting the climate crisis, but also doing our part to ensure that the Liberals deliver on real action. Donc, je veux commencer aujourd'hui en parlant de COP 21. Pour moi et pour nous comme parti, c'est vraiment important d'être là. Donc, ça, c'est pourquoi je vais assister à cette conférence. Et nos priorités pour cette conférence, c'est trois choses, effectivement. On veut pousser le gouvernement libéral et Justin Trudeau d'avoir des cibles plus audacieuses pour réduire nos émissions. Notre cible, c'est au moins 50% de réduction des émissions. Donc, on va essayer de mettre la pression sur le gouvernement libéral, sur Justin Trudeau, d'augmenter notre cible nationale pour réduire les émissions. Ils ont parlé de 40 ou 45%. On veut voir aussi, autant que possible, presque 50%. Donc, on va pousser ce gouvernement. Deuxièmement, on va continuer de dire clairement qu'on doit éliminer les subventions aux pétrolières. Le Premier ministre Justin Trudeau a promis d'éliminer ces subventions, mais au lieu de les éliminer, il les a augmentées. Donc, ce qu'on veut voir, c'est une élimination de ces subventions. Au lieu de subventionner les secteurs pétroliers, ce qu'on veut voir, c'est une subvention pour investir dans l'énergie renouvelable. Et c'est essentiel qu'on fait ça. Et finalement, dans notre avis, ce n'est pas possible de faire face à la crise climatique en laissant à côté les travailleurs et travailleuses. Donc, on veut voir un plan concret pour investir dans les emplois et pour donner des garanties aux travailleurs et travailleuses que vous ne serez pas laissés à côté. Donc, dans notre avis, on comprend l'urgence de faire face à la crise climatique, mais on croit profondément qu'on ne peut pas faire face à cette crise sans avoir un plan pour les travailleurs. Donc, ce sont les trois enjeux, les trois priorités pour nous. I also want to again remind folks that there is a deadline coming up. The Liberal government has a deadline of this Friday. The Justin Trudeau has a deadline of this Friday to decide whether or not he's going to continue to fight Indigenous kids in court. We again want to make it very clear. Justin Trudeau needs to stop the legal action against Indigenous kids, comply with the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal order, and work towards justice for Indigenous people. Donc, finalement, je vais ajouter qu'on a un deadline ce vendredi et c'est important pour ce gouvernement de décider s'ils vont continuer la poursuite contre les enfants autochtones ou non. On a dit à plusieurs reprises que ce gouvernement doit arrêter de poursuivre les enfants autochtones dans les cours et on va continuer d'exiger le gouvernement d'arrêter de faire ça tout de suite. Merci, and with that, I'm ready for any questions you might have.
Well, I'll take questions, starting with questions on the phone, alternating with questions in the room. One question, one follow-up per reporters. Nous allons maintenant passer aux questions, en commençant par les questions au téléphone, en alternance avec les questions dans la salle. Une question suivie par journaliste. Opérateur, avons-nous une première question?
Thank you for listening to Depictions Media Radio.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Just over a week ago, Albertans voted on a clear question. Should Section 36(2) of the Constitution Act 1982, Parliament and the Government of Canada's commitment to the principle of making equalization payments, be removed from the Constitution? Today, we have heard the results. A clear majority, 62% of Albertans have rejected the fundamentally unfair equalization program. In other words, 62% of Albertans are demanding a fair deal in the Canadian Federation. It received majority support in virtually every region of the province, in large urban centres, in mid-sized cities, and in small rural communities. Later today, I will be tabling a motion in the Legislative Assembly to ratify these results, which, if passed, will formally initiate a constitutional amendment negotiation. This is based on the very clear language of the Supreme Court of Canada in its 1998 secession reference, in which the Supreme Court said that the constitutional right of each participant in the Federation to initiate constitutional change must be recognized, and that this right implies a reciprocal duty on the other participants to engage in discussions to address any legitimate initiative to change the constitutional order. Albertans are and always have been proud Canadians. In many ways, I believe Albertans are big Canadians, generous Canadians. And in many ways, Alberta is the most Canadian of the 10 provinces because of the huge migration to this province from across the country, from Newfoundland to British Columbia. Hundreds of thousands of Canadians have come to Alberta to work hard and to pursue opportunity, to be part of our opportunity society. And Albertans are proud to have played a major role in Canadian prosperity, to have shared so much of our good fortune and hard work and the benefit of our natural resource wealth with other parts of Canada when times have been good here but bad elsewhere. In fact, Alberta taxpayers, through their federal taxes, have contributed over $630 billion net more to the rest of the country than they received back in federal benefits and transfers since the mid-1960s. $200 billion more in net contributions made by Alberta taxpayers to Ottawa in the last decade alone. Even while we were going through a period of deep economic adversity, the recession that began in 2015, Albertans continued to make a net contribution to the Federation in the range of $20 billion a year. And again, Albertans have always been proud to share much of their good fortune with the rest of the country. But all we have asked for, and what we are saying with these referendum results, is that we must have a fair deal. If Ottawa and our fellow provinces want to benefit from the hard work and the resources of Albertans, then Ottawa must allow us to develop those resources, to grow our economy. Instead, what we have faced is an endless series of discriminatory legislation and policies that have impeded Alberta's economy, undermined our constitutional authority, including our ownership and control of our own natural resources. And all of this has resulted in tens of thousands of lost jobs, of dreams dashed, of people moving from prosperity in too many cases to despair. Today's results speak clearly about that frustration. Federal laws and policies that have singled out Alberta, like, for example, the tanker ban, the first time in Canadian history that the Government of Canada has specified one product to be banned for export, a product that is only produced in Alberta. A clear and direct attack on our economic interests. Bill C-69, the so-called new Federal Environmental Assessment Act, we call it the No More Pipelines Law, a clear violation of Alberta's exclusive constitutional authority under Section 92A of the Constitution. A critical win by Premier Peter Lougheed, a recognition that in each province the legislature may exclusively make laws in relation to exploration for non-renewable resources in the province, without which Alberta would not have ratified the 1982 Constitution Act. And yet that essential power, so critically important for our prosperity, is under direct attack from Ottawa. The Trudeau government's killing of the Northern Gateway pipeline, they're killing effectively through regulation of the Energy East pipeline project. Their abject surrender to the presidential veto of the Keystone XL pipeline. Watching other provinces now being given effective vetoes over interprovincial pipelines while importing energy from overseas. Other provinces banning development of natural resources and thereby benefiting under the current unfair equalization formula. While Albertans contribute typically $20 billion a year, the government of Quebec receiving $13 billion a year in equalization payments while expressing a political veto over oil and gas pipelines and refusing to develop its own resources. These are just some of the aspects of unfairness that have caused Albertans for so many years to demand basic respect and to demonstrate a respect not only for our economic aspirations, but for the Constitution of Canada. And so this is a powerful statement today, a democratic statement where Albertans are demanding to be respected. They're demanding that the jurisdiction of this province under the Canadian Constitution be respected, and demanding that we be able to develop this economy and responsibly develop our resources so that, yes, the rest of Canada can continue to benefit from Alberta's future prosperity. So later today, I will be tabling, as I say, a motion in the legislature to ratify these referendum results and to initiate the amendment process. And we fully expect the Prime Minister to respect the constitutional amendment process and to sit down and negotiate with Alberta in good faith. Of course, our focus ultimately, as I say, is a fair deal, a broader reform of the system of fiscal federalism, a retroactive lifting of the fiscal stabilization program cap to recognize the huge adversity that Alberta has faced in recent years, the repeal or substantial amendment of the No More Pipelines law, the repeal of the discriminatory tanker ban, which targets this province alone, and so much more. In addition, of course, today, we are releasing the results from Elections Alberta on the referendum held on the proposal to maintain daylight savings time throughout the year. And I understand the results were 50.1% voting no, 49.9% voting yes. And so we thank everybody who came to express their opinion on that issue. We will, of course, respect the outcome and not pursue this matter any further. The context here, of course, is that all of our neighboring jurisdictions, British Columbia, Saskatchewan, Yukon, the northwestern U.S. states are all moving, in the process of moving to year-round daylight savings time, and we thought it was important to consult Albertans on whether they wanted to follow suit. It's as close as it gets to a tie, I think, with about a 2,500 vote difference, but we respect certainly the majority in that referendum. And finally, I'd like to congratulate Pam Davidson, Erica Barudis, and Michaelo Martinyuk on their election as Alberta's Senate nominees. This is an important renewal of Alberta's longstanding tradition of Senate democracy. This was the fourth election for Alberta Senate nominees held since the late 1980s, when the government of then Premier Getty oversaw the first Senate election. Of course, we've had 5 of those selected or elected nominees go on to serve in Canada's upper chamber, having been appointed by previous prime ministers, including Senator Scott Tannis, who continues very capably to represent Alberta. There are 2 vacant Alberta seats in the Senate, and so I will be introducing a motion in the legislature later today calling on the Prime Minister to respect the basic principle of democracy and to fill those 2 seats with senators, Senate nominees selected by Albertans in last week's election. These individuals received, respectively, 382,000 votes, 358,000 votes, and 237,000 votes. These are enormous democratic mandates. There is a convention of prime ministers respecting Alberta Senate democracy, and this shouldn't be difficult. It shouldn't be controversial to simply respect democracy. So we'll be recommending that further to a conversation I had with the Prime Minister in July, we'll be recommending to Ms. Davidson, Ms. Baroudis, and Mr. Martinyuk that they apply through the Federal Senate Appointment Advisory Council, but really that should be simply a technical process. There should be these people, the top two vote getters should be automatically appointed to the vacant Alberta Senate seats so that Alberta will have strong, democratically elected voices in the upper chamber of Canada's Parliament.
Thank you for listening to Depictions Media Radio.
Good afternoon. My name's Maren Smith, and I'm a fellow at Simon Fraser University, the founder of Clean Energy Canada, and the co-chair of BC's Climate Solutions Council. And I'd like to acknowledge that Premier Horgan and I are on the traditional territory of the Lekwungen-speaking people, the Songhees, and the Esquimalt First Nation. It's my pleasure to be here today in person with Premier Horgan. With the cyclone bomb going on out there, we are here in Victoria, and we're going to be joined virtually by Minister Heyman, plus my colleagues from the Climate Solutions Council, Colleen Giraud-Schmidt and Mark Jackard, plus the president of C-SPAN Marine Transportation, Ian McIver. Ian was going to be hosting us today, but the weather's switched things up for us. And the weather has been a conversation in BC over the past year. We felt the devastating impacts of climate change firsthand this summer. We watched the community of Lytton burn to the ground due to climate change. The heat dome killed crops and wildlife and British Columbians, some of our friends and our neighbors. I grew up in this province, running around as a kid in the summer, breathing clean air. But this summer, we all breathe smoke, and for days, some of us, and for weeks, others. And this is really the new normal for our kids in the summers in British Columbia. It's being called a climate emergency around the world, and here in BC, we're feeling the impacts here. So in order to solve this emergency, every nation, every province or state, city or council, and community and businesses, we all need to do our part. So when Minister Heyman asked me to join the BC Climate Solutions Council, I knew we had an opportunity to do the right thing here in BC, to cut our carbon pollution, to transition to clean energy and away from fossil fuels, and to transition to a 21st century economy that was more equitable and inclusive, including with Indigenous nations. So I'm very, very pleased to be here today with the Premier and the Minister to announce BC's next phase of climate action. It's my pleasure to introduce Premier Horgan.
Here we go. Good?
Where's my mask?
Pocket. Thank you, Maren, and good afternoon, everyone. It is great to be here on the traditional territory of the Lekwungen-speaking people. I want to thank Maren and Colleen for their work with the Climate Solutions Council. I want to thank Dr. Jackard for his, quite frankly, lifetime of work on this very important subject. And to Ian McIver, thank you as well for helping us today launch the Clean BC Roadmap to 2030. A strong and ambitious climate plan to deliver on BC's commitment to reduce climate pollution, build a better, cleaner economy for everyone, and doing so with the enormous progress that we've made over the past couple of years. With the support of Clean BC, companies like C-SPAN and Corvus Energy have joined forces to make shipping cleaner and more affordable, not just here in British Columbia, but indeed internationally. And C-SPAN is converting a cargo ferry from fossil fuels to biofuels. We would have been talking about that in more detail. I'm sure Ian will say something about that later on in the agenda. But he'll talk about Corvus and homegrown batteries and all of the technological innovation that's coming out of British Columbia as we collectively do our part to address the globe's biggest challenge. Maren touched upon this past summer, but I've had the honor of being Premier for 4 summers now, and 3 of those 4 summers were the worst fire seasons in BC history. Add on to that the devastation of the heat dome this past summer, and I think all British Columbians, indeed all Canadians, are focused on making progress on climate change, not sometime in the future, but right now. The threat is no longer decades away. It is here with us in everything that we do. Impacts of flooding, which will likely follow the cyclone bomb of this weekend, are also ever present for people living in British Columbia. Our rivers used to be the highway for our salmon. Now they are potential devastation for our communities, and that has to stop. We need to make sure that we're regulating the carbon emissions of our largest polluters. We need to make sure we're assisting people in making a transition from how they do business today to how we need to do business in the future. And I believe that the progress that we've made under the leadership of Minister Heyman is outstanding relative to our friends across the country and indeed across the continent. But we can't rest on our laurels. Indeed, now is the time when British Columbians and Canadians are focused on the imperative of action to work with the incoming federal government to deliver on the promise of Clean BC here. And I believe our roadmap will do that by powering businesses and communities to make changes in how they act. In changes, that means using our abundance of clean electricity, electrifying those fossil fuel industries that are still out there, and making sure as we put a cap on those emissions, reduce methane pollution, we can do so in a way that makes a transition over time so that we meet our 2030 goals and we get to net zero by 2050. The C-SPAN Corvus example is there, and I'm sure Ian will talk about that. But our province is uniquely positioned to thrive in a low-carbon economy. For decades now in British Columbia, successive governments have focused on this initiative, and we have dialed it up since 2017 because the chance and the opportunity to build an economy that's focused on clean energy, focused on reducing emissions, is exactly what British Columbians have asked us to do, and we have every intention of delivering on that promise to everyone in British Columbia. We have to have the same common purpose to attacking climate change that we have had to attacking COVID-19. This transcends political boundaries. It transcends regions of British Columbia, all of us working together with a singular focus on lifting up everyone. As we put a price on carbon pollution, we have to make sure that the low-income and moderate-income British Columbians do not suffer from that. As we bring forward initiatives to make housing less carbon-focused and more carbon-friendly, we need to make sure that there are government programs in place that will stimulate the economic activity that will build the economy of the future. There are challenges ahead for all of us, there is no doubt. But with challenge also comes opportunity. C-SPAN and Corvus can speak to that. But it's not just those 2 companies, it's companies right across British Columbia that have been focusing for the past decade on how they can take this challenge and make it an opportunity, create wealth and opportunity for themselves and other British Columbians. That's our focus with the roadmap to 2030. I'll now pass it on to Minister Heyman. He can provide more details on how we're going to get there.
Thank you very much, Premier. I want to acknowledge that I and other speakers are joining you today from the traditional territories of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh nations. Today's a really important day for climate action and the clean economy in British Columbia. I want to thank you, Premier Horgan, for your leadership. I also want to thank Marin Smith, Colleen Giroux-Schmidt, and Mark Jackard, all of whom have played an important role in the development of this Clean BC roadmap and have shown leadership in British Columbia to tackle this issue for a long time. I also want to recognize the leadership of Ian McIver and the entire team at C-SPAN. It's too bad that due to today's weather, we could not be on site at C-SPAN today. Today's announcement is the result of significant collaboration between businesses and government, Indigenous nations, all levels of government, in fact, and the public coming together. It shows what we can accomplish when we're working together. Our government has taken the advice, the independent advice of the Climate Solutions Council, made up of members who represent diverse backgrounds across British Columbia, policy experts, labour leaders, youth, business, local government, Indigenous leaders, and environmental organizations. The science is crystal clear about our climate emergency. Weather events like this weekend and today are becoming more impactful, and the time to act is now. This Clean BC roadmap is our plan to fully meet our 2030 emissions target and build new opportunities for people across BC. The roadmap includes accelerated and expanded actions across different pathways with a focus on affordability and supporting business transitions. The roadmap considers the state of clean technology and solutions for each sector and works to bring down costs and increase availability. It builds on and strengthens the actions that we have already taken since 2018 with Clean BC and that are on track to significantly reduce emissions. It also includes new ones. We've had early successes, but we know that much more needs to be done, and that's why we've developed this roadmap to reach 100% of our 2030 target and set the foundation for future years and future targets. Across British Columbia, people have responded positively since we first announced our plan. For example, British Columbia has the largest uptake of electric vehicles per capita on this continent. We were the first jurisdiction in the world with a 100% zero-emission law in place. And we're going to accelerate that with this roadmap. BC will mandate that 90% of all new car truck sales be clean and zero emission by 2030 and 100% by 2035. We can do this because we've seen that the auto industry and other governments saw what we were doing and decided that we need to move faster, spurred on by actions that we and other subnationals have taken. Also, as part of this roadmap, we're developing new medium and heavy-duty vehicle zero-emission requirements because the science is clear. We need to rapidly move to clean energy in absolutely everything we do. We know that the global economy is quickly moving toward a net zero emissions future. There are investment opportunities for companies that have a commitment to net zero emissions. That, in fact, is on the agenda for the upcoming UN Climate Conference in Glasgow. And in turn, companies that don't have a plan are facing stiff questioning from investors who are turning away. In BC, some of our largest industrial operators, accounting for 50% of our industrial emissions, have already taken the first step and committed to reaching net zero emissions by 2050. Our roadmap will help BC industry thrive in this new environment, so our exports are not replaced by higher carbon products from elsewhere. We've already launched 22 emission reduction projects together with industry through our Clean BC Industry Fund, and these projects are expected to reduce nearly 1 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent between now and 2030. We also recently announced a range of measures with BC Hydro to encourage switching to clean electricity. Our plan means that BC will attract only industrial projects that are already designed to be low carbon in line with our targets and ready for a net zero emissions future. This will reduce the emissions impact of any new industrial development. We made our oil and gas sectoral targets clear a year ago, and this roadmap includes our commitment to meet that reduction target. We will work with experts, industry, and Indigenous nations on programs and policies that will achieve this, including regulation where necessary. This roadmap also includes a wide range of additional policies that will ensure industry emissions are in line with our sectoral and provincial emission reduction targets, while also maintaining healthy business environment and competitiveness. The roadmap has many, many more actions to transition to a cleaner future and to maintain affordability in buildings, in communities, in transportation across British Columbia. We know that the changing climate is creating uncertainty for British Columbians and everyone around the globe. Risks and creativity are part of this equation. but actions can fuel optimism and success. Thriving in this environment takes leadership. Leadership by government, leadership by communities, leadership by industry, and it takes improving as we learn more. Today, we want to acknowledge the leadership that C-SPAN has taken to move its ferry fleet to a net zero future. The combination of electrification, low-carbon fuels, and a re-examination of the way it operates puts C-SPAN among the first in their sector to design their net zero future. This reflects a BC brand of leadership, and I want to offer thanks to C-SPAN CEO Ian McIver for seeing this opportunity and for making it happen. What is taking place at C-SPAN is now happening right across the province. People are seeing the opportunities for change and moving to a cleaner, brighter future. The Clean BC roadmap that our government has put together, along with our accountability measures in the Climate Change Accountability Act, are very important tools in building that future. Thank you very much, and I'd now like to introduce Ian McIver, President of C-SPAN Marine Transportation, to say a few words.
Thank you very much, Mr. Heyman, and the Premier, too, for this opportunity to tell the C-SPAN story and our journey to a greener future. C-SPAN Marine Transportation is continually evaluating our options for alternative and low-carbon fuels, and we're very excited to have several successful projects under our belt and others in development. C-SPAN Marine is invested with High Sea, our Heisla Nation joint venture to service LNG Canada, in LNG-fueled escort tugs, as well as full electric ship docking tugs. Likewise, C-SPAN Ferries has LNG hybrid ro-ro vessels. These are ferries operating between the Lower Mainland and Vancouver Island since 2016, and will soon add 2 more LNG hybrid vessels to that fleet by first quarter of 2022. C-SPAN has been working closely with Clean BC and with the BC Low Carbon Fuel Standards in order to utilize existing legislation to lead the way in emissions reductions in the marine industry. We're happy that BC has such a strong greenhouse gas reduction regulation, and we look forward to continuing the development of this policy and the resulting programs. As part of our emissions reduction strategy, we've found ways to bring several low-emissions fuels and technologies into our fleet. Biofuels. C-SPAN Ferries has successfully tested and operated vessels on 100% biofuel, which offers significant reduction in GHGs. We'll run vessels on biofuel as part of our long-term emissions reduction strategy, and we'll increase its usage across our fleets where it is the best solution to reduce emissions. With LNG, C-SPAN Ferries and C-SPAN Marine both have vessels either in operation or in construction that consume LNG as fuel. LNG already offers a sizable reduction in greenhouse gases, but with the introduction of carbon-neutral sources of natural gas, such as renewable natural gas, RNG, from FortisBC, this reduction can be multiplied. We successfully completed a carbon-neutral RNG pilot with our supply partners, FortisBC, after the recent reopening of their RNG program, and will look to increase RNG consumption as the program and volumes available move forward. Propulsion battery technology. C-SPAN Marine, through investment in battery hybrid vessels for C-SPAN Ferries, or full battery-powered ship docking tugs with the High Sea Marine company, continues to leverage battery technology for propulsion systems. The use of batteries allows us to reduce our reliance on fossil fuels and to work with BC Hydro to fuel our ships with clean electricity. C-SPAN Ferries has been operating these hybrid vessels since 2016, and we continue to invest in those vessels by installing larger battery banks, and that is with our partners at Corvus Energy. So we're replacing some of the battery banks with larger ones. Zero emissions vehicles. We have vehicles running around in our terminals, and we are moving towards testing and hopefully a future investment in a whole fleet of battery electric terminal trucks. They'll be fueled, of course, with clean electricity from BC Hydro. We have a very strong feeling that that's going to be a successful project moving forward. Lastly, from the fuel side of things, we're looking at LNG as a bunker fuel. This is a prime gateway here in Vancouver to Asia for Canadian commodities and trade. C-SPAN will continue to leverage the clean LNG resources here in Canada and is currently developing an LNG bunkering business with Fortis to enable foreign-going vessels calling on Vancouver to have access to clean LNG and RLNG, renewable LNG, to power their ships. The last thing, we are an operating company, and one of the things that I think we all need to think about is how we operate and efficiently deploy our assets and use technology in the deployment of our assets to minimize emissions across all platforms, regardless of the fuel type. And I think that's a big initiative that everybody should be working on. So in closing, 2030, it's only 8 years from now, and we need all the tools the government has at its disposal to support our efforts to ensure we collectively meet those 2030 and 2050 climate action goals. So that's my remarks for now, and I'd like to introduce Colleen Giroux-Schmidt. She's the co-chair of the Climate Solution Council and VP at Energia. So I'll introduce her right now.
Thank you. I'd like to start by expressing my gratitude for being here today on the traditional lands of the Squamish, the Musqueam, and the Tsleil-Waututh. I'd also like to express gratitude to the Premier, to Minister Heyman, for their government's leadership in announcing the roadmap today. I'd also like to share my gratitude with my colleagues from the Climate Solutions Council. It's an incredible group of people that challenged and were able to work and push, I think, to help the roadmap be what it is today. And I'd also like to express gratitude to my colleagues at Interjex who shared me for this last 2 years. The council experience for me has been interwoven with becoming a parent. The minister asked me to join the council when I was expecting my first son, and he's been in the background for many of our meetings this year. I highlight this today to underscore the sense of urgency for why we need to act. These dates are not abstract. 2030, my son will be 11 years old. In 2035, when we have a 100% zero-emission vehicle reg here in BC, he'll be 16 and learning to drive, maybe. And in 2050, he's going to be younger than I am right now. So the roadmap is great, but it also is going to require a lot of work from all of us. And so we need to get started this afternoon. As been mentioned, the scope of this challenge and opportunity is vast. It's going to need cooperation and action from all levels of government. It's going to need the commitment and funding from the private sector. And it's going to need all of us as individuals also contributing. The opportunity we have in front of us is to transform our society, our economy, and our lives here in British Columbia and around the world. This isn't about tinkering with what we have to date. This is about looking at what we need to be in 2050 and beyond, and working to build that society and economy today. BC has an opportunity to thrive in this. And at Interjex, we believe in building a better world through renewable energy, and we're here to contribute and see this opportunity through. I want to finish by sharing the story of the hummingbird. Can't see it on camera, but I've got hummingbird on my dress and on my mask. Hummingbird was in a forest that was burning, and all of the other animals were standing and watching their home burn. Hummingbird went to the river and took a drop of water in her beak and went and dropped it on the flames. And she did this again and again. The other animals asked Hummingbird, "What are you doing?" And she responded, "What I can." We all need to be Hummingbird now going forward so that in 2050, my son is not having this conversation again, and he's living in that better world.
Thank you for listening today to Policy and Rights. And I hope that you've learned something, maybe figured out something you can do as a person, as a single person, or maybe as a single household to do your part in helping us all curb this climate crisis. So, you've been listening to Policy and Rights here on Depictions Media Radio. I was your host, Michael Clogs.